Faith for the Apocalypse. My name is Nick, and this channel is a space for us to talk about faith, politics, and whatever else we want, which today is going to be some history and some not so fun to think about truths as we start a new series called How the Fuck Did We Get Here? Now, this series is inspired by kind of a series of conversations that I've had in my personal and professional life with folks who report that they are feeling really kind of surprised and overwhelmed and in shock as they watch the actions that our government and our political leaders are taking. For many, they are looking at the actions of our government and feeling like this isn't the country that I believe in. This isn't the country that I was raised in. And unfortunately, while we may feel that way, that's not necessarily the truth. Because the reality is the government and the system that we have now is one that has been carefully created, dreamed of, and worked towards. In many cases, there have been movements happening in the shadows or online or behind closed doors that we may not have been aware of. And these movements have worked over years in order to shape our current conditions. So, for the next 3 weeks, we are going to be digging into some of these movements, starting today with white supremacy, picking up next week with Christian nationalism, and closing out our series with a discussion of the corporate takeover of ethical and religious spaces. Before we dig into our topic today, I think it can be helpful to be crystal clear about the kind of language that we are using. Today, we're not just talking about race or racism or racial prejudice or racial bias. We are talking about explicit white supremacy, the belief that white people are inherently superior to people of all other races and thus should have complete control over a society in which they are the top of a social and political pyramid where other racial groups are seen as not entirely human. In my kind of DEI trainings on racial bias and how it affects our lives, I'm really quick to point out how we can unintentionally support racist systems that have unequal race hierarchies without fervently believing in those hierarchies. We all live in a system where we can accidentally replicate harmful ideas. That's not the kind of racial bias we're talking about today, though. In today's video, we are talking about explicit, hateful, and often violent perspectives about the quote unquote natural order of racial hierarchy. Today, we are talking about those people who are consciously supporting policies and practices that seek to harm and limit the liberty of others in order to further themselves and their own communities. This is a topic that can feel uncomfortable and for some might feel like it's just a kind of fringe group and small part of the population. But unfortunately, recent history has told us that that's not true. White supremacy is actually on the rise. So, how active are white supremacist organizations here in the United States right now? Well, the most recent data that we have that is kind of full annual comprehensive data is for the year 2023. And that's because of how long it takes for us to collect, measure data, and create a report. We hope to see some numbers for 2024 later this year. But in 2023, according to a report called The Year in Hate and Extremism 2023, put out by the Southern Poverty Law Center, the number of white supremacy hate groups surged in 2023, increasing by 50%, jumping from 109 registered hate groups to 165 documented white supremacist hate groups. And according to an FBI crime statistics report from that same year, there were over 11,862 hate crimes, which is a 228 number of incident increase over the previous year. Also in 2023, the Anti-Defamation League recorded a 12% increase in white supremacist propaganda incidents, with a total of 7,567 cases. That means that 2023 is the second year in a row that can brag by saying it has the highest number ever of white supremacist propaganda incidences since the Anti Defamation League started tracking them in the 90s. In 2023, there were 282 documented white supremacist rallies or other events, which is a 63% increase over the year before. And in 2023, more than 50 different white supremacist groups and networks distributed propaganda, but 3 of them were responsible for 92% of the activity, including the Patriot Front, which has a particularly close relationship with our current governmental systems. Now, this seems like a lot, and it gets a little bit scarier. The Southern Poverty Law Center documented that there are 1,430 hate and anti government extremist groups that comprise the organizational infrastructure which currently upholds white supremacy in the US. And a growing number of those groups and organizations are finding themselves to have the ear of our political leaders. And in many cases, our political leaders are themselves members of some of these extremist groups. White supremacy in American political spaces is not something new. In fact, white supremacy is just about as American as apple pie, as we are a country that was founded on slavery and racial inequity, even writing it into our Constitution that Black people were 3/5 of a person. Our whole system was based on a racial hierarchy, and our American history has been one of kind of beginning to dismantle that kind of form of oppression and inequity and responses of anger when that occurs. Now, while ideas of white supremacy have been kind of at the foundation of our government from the very beginning, the kind of terrorist, hateful white supremacy that we are talking about today can be traced back to 1865 with the founding of the Ku Klux Klan amidst the post Civil War Reconstruction. Many consider the Ku Klux Klan and its founding in 1865 to be the very beginning of American terrorism, as they are the first American terrorist organization. I think that's helpful for us to point out that the first American terrorist organization was a white supremacist organization that also claimed to be a Christian movement. Because that's the thing. In the United States, white supremacy has been very closely tied to particular kinds of Christian religious identity. In many communities and spaces, churches are the places where white supremacist ideas are spread and shared, and where white supremacist political organizing is happening. There is a great movie that came out last year called The Order, where Nicholas Hoult plays a young leader of a white supremacist terrorist cell. One of the most upsetting and moving parts of the movie for me was a conversation that happens between Nicholas Hoult, this young, dangerous activist, and the leader of his white supremacist church. During this conversation, Nicholas Hoult expresses his frustration of having to live under the injustice that he sees in the system around him, as he is calling for violence and explosions and all of those terrible things. In the scene, he is talking to his religious leader, who tells him that he needs to slow down and to wait and be patient. Not because these ideas of hate are wrong, but because the approach of violence is incorrect. There's no need to go and blow up the state house. We've been at work for years, and we have a plan to get our people elected. That scene is so scary because it's a premonition and a prediction from that character of a reality that we have lived through. The reality is that white supremacists have been at work for a long time in our country, since at least the Reconstruction era. And in many cases, that white supremacy is taking many forms. One form is the terror and the propaganda and the violence, but the other form is a very respectable and properly done form of political organizing, through which these networks that span our country work together with one another in order to replace judges with those who are sympathetic toward their perspective, in order to support young politicians as they move through the ranks spreading white hate, in order to fund initiatives and laws and executive orders and their work that seeks to codify our systems of inequity and our systems of hate, and ultimately potentially exterminate whole groups of people because they have been deemed as not enough or not the same. White supremacy didn't just pop into our political system out of nowhere. It was put there through years of effort. While many of us weren't even looking, while many of us weren't even aware that it was happening. Now, as we talk about white supremacists, you might have a few different ideas that come to mind about who a white supremacist might be. I know for many, our idea of what a white supremacist is comes from television or media. We might imagine a white supremacist as someone in a terrorist organization who is making bombs and seeking to cause destruction. We might imagine a white supremacist as a low income individual from a rural community with low access to education. This person might be the villain in an action show who is waiting to get punched because they are kind of seen as an acceptable villain because of these racist perspectives. We also might imagine the more nefarious and scary suited white supremacist who attends community meetings and town halls, who is able to run for office and gain support by campaigning on family issues. We might also imagine white supremacists as people who are part of social organizations and networks that, while seemingly friendly and nice, actually reflect really scary views once you break it down. I'm imagining here the groups of mothers who gather over concern for the safety of their children, but end up falling into traps of dangerous language and propaganda that pull them to places of hate. And unfortunately, social media has allowed ideas and practices around white supremacy to flourish in new audiences that they might not have otherwise reached. For young men, we saw the kind of trend of the pickup culture, the tips and tricks you can learn to pick up women, slide from conversations of loneliness into conversations of hate and anger as influencers like Andrew Tate welcome young men into white supremacist ideology. Young women are also being recruited on the internet as they enter chat rooms about crunchy granola topics like eating clean or avoiding chemicals with your children, that eventually invite them into conversations of avoiding medical advice, vaccines, and supporting damaging racial perspectives. The reason why white supremacy is able to attract kind of new people is because of the way that it can attach itself to other ideological perspectives and warp them to its own purposes. Just as the Ku Klux Klan took Christian ideas of community and brotherhood and warped them into ideas of exclusion and hate, so too it connects to ideas that young people have about their lives, desires for connection, desire for cleanliness and purity, and a world we can understand is then co opted and repurposed into supporting hate and division and exclusion. Individuals are met in their moments of fear, confusion, or loneliness and are provided answers that may seem simple and may make sense within our echo chambers. But in reality, this hateful ideology seeks to take advantage of those individuals in order to further a really scary worldview, one that includes domination, control, and extinction of other people. White supremacy has flourished in the darkness. It is like mushrooms. You feed it and you leave it in the dark, and it will bloom and explode. In order for us to fight white supremacy, we have to shine a light. We have to be willing to look at what's happening, to talk about what's going on, to educate ourselves and those around us of the danger of the rising tide of white supremacy and of the hidden white supremacist language and symbols that we might be missing. Now, I know I've just barely scratched the top of this topic. We could do a whole series that digs into white supremacy all year long to better understand what's happening. But I encourage you, if you haven't already, to sign up for those daily Devo emails. This week, our Devo is going to help us dig into this topic a little bit better. Today, on Monday, we will look a little bit more closely at that data about the rise of white supremacy. On Tuesday, we will talk about our biblical and divine call to racial justice and talk about why our faith requires us to respond. On Wednesday, we'll talk about dog whistle white supremacy and talk about the different signs and symbols that we can notice, that we can watch for, that we can listen for in order to know when white supremacy is being spread. On Thursday, we will talk about some practical strategies that we can use to resist white supremacist messages and fight back against white supremacist ideology. Finally, on Friday, we will take a break. This topic is heavy and hard. So on Friday, we will care for our soul and look towards African traditions for inspiration as we decenter whiteness and listen to voices of color to refill us with hope and love on Friday. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for digging into this topic and talking about the hard thing. I know it's not easy, but friends, if we are unwilling to talk about what the enemy is up to, then we are at risk of them winning. In the weekly overview for this week, I have also included suggestions for some movies, some books, and some podcast episodes that can help you dig a little bit deeper into this history. I just was able to kind of gloss over and give you highlights. If you are wanting to learn more, I really encourage you to check out those continuing resources and to make some time in your schedule for learning. Thank you so much for being here with us today. I will be praying for you, and I hope to see you next week as we pick up with Christian nationalism.